In the shadow of decaying steel mills and boarded-up storefronts, Riverton, Pennsylvania, lay under a blanket of November 2025 snow, its streets quiet except for the crunch of boots on frostbitten pavement. Jim Holloway, a 66-year-old veteran of the Iraq War, moved like a specter through the town's forgotten alleys, his once proud frame now stooped under a tattered olive-drab coat, its pockets bulging with scavenged scraps. Jim had served as a staff sergeant in the 101st Airborne, leading patrols through the deserts of Fallujah in 2003, earning a Bronze Star for pulling 3 soldiers from a burning Humvee under enemy fire. His hands, scarred from shrapnel, trembled slightly as he adjusted the frayed strap of his rucksack, a relic of his military days now stuffed with aluminum cans and bits of wire he collected for pennies. The town had once thrived, its factories humming with life, but now it was a ghost, its soul cracked open like the rusted silos dotting the horizon. Jim's life mirrored that decline. After his wife, Ellen, succumbed to untreated diabetes in 2022, a condition the VA clinic had failed to manage due to repeated scheduling errors, he sold their modest bungalow on Pine Lane, donating the proceeds to a local children's literacy program she championed. With no kids and no family left, he vanished into Riverton's underbelly, a man erased by grief and neglect. The townsfolk barely acknowledged him, their eyes skimming past the gray-haired figure with a weathered face etched with lines of hardship. Each morning, he'd rise from a cardboard shelter behind the abandoned textile mill, the cold biting through his thin layers, and shuffle toward Rosie's Cafe on Main Street, where Rosie, a plump waitress with a heart as warm as her coffee, would slide him a mug when her manager wasn't looking. "Keep your strength, Jim," she'd murmur, her voice a lifeline in his desolate world. But the cold grew sharper with each passing day, and hunger gnawed at him with a ferocity he hadn't felt since dodging IEDs in the desert. By the 4th day without a substantial meal, his hands shook uncontrollably, his vision blurred, and his stomach twisted with a pain that threatened to break his resolve. He leaned against a brick wall, catching his breath, the rucksack slipping to the ground as he fought the dizziness. Riverton had forgotten him, and Jim wondered if he'd fade away entirely, a footnote in a town that no longer cared. Yet deep within, a flicker of the soldier he'd been lingered, a stubborn refusal to surrender, even as the winter tightened its grip. He thought of Ellen, her laughter echoing in his mind, her final words urging him to hold on. That memory, fragile as it was, kept him moving, one shaky step at a time, toward a desperate act he knew might cost him what little dignity remained. The snow fell heavier as Jim staggered into Harper's General Store, a squat building with peeling paint and a flickering, open, sign that buzzed like a dying insect. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale bread, overripe bananas, and the sharp tang of disinfectant, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Jim's stomach growled as he approached the discount bin near the back, where bruised apples, hardened rolls, and dented cans sat under a faded 50% off label. His hands, rough and chapped from the cold, hovered over a loaf of day-old bread, its crust cracked but still soft, and an apple with a bruised side that promised a bite of sweetness. He hadn't eaten since a half-eaten sandwich Rosie had slipped him 2 days ago, and the hunger was a beast clawing at his insides, more relentless than any enemy he'd faced in Iraq. He glanced around. Mr. Harper, the store's wiry owner with a perpetual scowl, was ringing up a customer at the counter, his attention elsewhere, while a young stock clerk, barely 16, shuffled cans at the far end, lost in the rhythm of his earbuds. The store was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and for a moment, Jim felt the weight of his morals pressing down, a soldier's code he'd lived by for decades. But survival trumped honor this time. With trembling fingers, he slipped the bread into his coat pocket, the fabric stretching over the bulge, then added the apple, his heart pounding as if he were back in a firefight. He fumbled with the zipper, his cold-numbed hands clumsy, and turned toward the door, head bowed to avoid eye contact. Each step felt like a betrayal, but the hunger drove him forward, a primal force he couldn't resist. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" Mr. Harper's voice boomed, sharp and accusing, cutting through the store like a gunshot. Jim froze, his breath catching in his throat. Harper marched toward him, his face flushed with anger, eyes narrowing as he spotted the bulge in Jim's coat. I needed it," Jim stammered, his voice weak, but Harper wasn't listening. He snatched the phone from the counter, dialing with furious jabs. "Police! We've got a thief here, some old bum!" he growled, his words a slap to Jim's pride. Jim didn't fight back. He stood there, hollow-eyed, the bread and apple still pressed against his chest, a pitiful prize for a man who'd once commanded respect. Within minutes, a patrol car's siren wailed outside, its red and blue lights flashing through the frosted windows. Officers Mark Sullivan, a stocky man with a buzz cut, and Officer Taryn Gwynn, whose sharp gaze missed nothing, stepped inside. Sullivan barked orders into his radio, while Tara's eyes lingered on the faded army patch on Jim's sleeve. "You served?" she asked quietly, her tone softening. Jim nodded, his throat tight. "Iraq. 2003, long time ago." Tara hesitated, her hand hovering over her cuffs, but Sullivan was already moving, his voice firm. "Doesn't matter, ma'am. He stole. Let's go." As they escorted him out, the bread fell to the floor, rolling under a shelf, a silent testament to his fall. The few shoppers in the store stared, some with disgust, others with pity, but no one spoke, no one intervened. Jim's dignity, already threadbare, unraveled further with each step toward the squad car, the cold air biting at his exposed shame. The holding cell at Riverton's police station was a stark, gray box, its concrete walls damp with condensation, the air thick with the smell of mildew and despair. Jim sat on the thin bench, his army coat draped over his shoulders like a shroud, the cold seeping into his bones despite the flickering heater in the corner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that danced across his weathered face, etched with lines of grief and exhaustion. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, creased photo of Ellen, her smile radiant against the backdrop of their backyard garden, a memory from a time when life had meaning. "I failed you, Ellie," he whispered, his voice cracking in the empty space, the words swallowed by the cell's silence. The bread and apple were gone, confiscated as evidence, and his stomach gnawed with a hunger that felt like a living thing, a reminder of his fall from grace. He hadn't resisted the arrest, hadn't raised a hand when the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Years of discipline had taught him to endure, to wait out the storm. But this storm was different, a personal battle against a world that had turned its back on him. The other inmates, a mix of drunks and petty thieves, paid him little heed. One, a lanky kid with a shaved head and a sneer, leaned against the bars, muttering, "Another old fool thinking he's owed something. Bet those war stories are lies." Jim didn't respond, his gaze fixed on Ellen's photo, letting the insults slide off him like water. He'd faced worse, mortar rounds, ambushes, the loss of comrades, and this was just another scar. Outside, the snow piled higher, muffling the town's sounds, a blanket over a place that had forgotten its own history. Officer Taryn Gwynn couldn't shake the image of Jim's army patch as she filled out her report in the station's break room. She'd grown up hearing her uncle, a Vietnam vet, talk about the brotherhood of soldiers, and something in Jim's quiet dignity struck a chord. She sipped her coffee, glancing at Officer Sullivan, who was scrolling through his phone, uninterested. "That guy, Jim Holloway, he's a vet," she said, her voice low. "We should check his background." Sullivan shrugged, his tone dismissive. "He stole, Tara. Vet or not, the law's the law." But Tara wasn't convinced. She pulled up Jim's file on the station computer, her fingers pausing over the sparse details. No address, no family, a string of minor citations for vagrancy and loitering. Yet there was a note, honorable discharge, 2005, and a faded mention of a Bronze Star. Her curiosity deepened. She sensed a story buried beneath the grime and hunger. She printed the file, tucking it into her bag, determined to dig further. Back in the cell, Jim leaned against the wall, the photo pressed to his chest, his mind drifting to Fallujah, the heat, the dust, the screams of men he'd saved. He'd come home a hero, but the VA had lost his records, cutting his benefits when he couldn't prove his address after Ellen's death. The system had failed him, and now he sat here, a relic of a war no one remembered. The kid in the next cell laughed again, tossing a crumpled paper ball at Jim, who didn't flinch. Still got nothing to say, huh? The kid taunted. Jim closed his eyes, whispering to Ellen, I'm holding on, love. For you. The words were a prayer, a promise, as the snow outside built a wall between him and a world that had long since stopped seeing him. The Riverton Municipal Court was a grim hall, its peeling walls stained with decades of neglect, the air heavy with the musty scent of old wood and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow on the worn linoleum floor as Jim shuffled in on the morning of his hearing, his army coat stiff with frost, his wrists aching from the previous night's cuffs. The room was sparsely populated, a handful of locals, a board clerk with a nasal voice, and a young prosecutor named Daniel Reed, whose crisp suit and polished shoes seemed out of place amid the courtroom's decay. Jim sank into the defendant's chair, his rucksack wedged between his scuffed boots, feeling the weight of unseen judgment. The clerk droned through the docket. State versus James Holloway, petty theft. Jim rose when his name was called, his knees trembling like brittle branches, the murmur of the room a faint buzz in his ears. Reed stepped forward, his voice smooth and detached. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended stealing food from Harper's General Store. Surveillance confirms the act. He has no fixed address, no employment, and a history of loitering citations. The state recommends remand until trial to prevent further offenses. Judge Margaret Ellis, a stern woman in her early 60s with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, flipped through Jim's file with practiced efficiency. She'd seen countless cases of vagrants and petty thieves, her gavel a tool to move them along the system's conveyor belt. But as she opened the file, a small, tarnished object slipped out, a dog tag, its chain tangled, the inscription, Holloway James R., U.S. Army. Catching the light, Margaret froze, her breath hitching. She looked up at Jim, her eyes narrowing as she studied the man before her, a stooped figure with a face carved by hardship, yet holding a trace of the soldier he'd once been. 5-minute recess, she declared abruptly, her voice cutting through the room's hum. Reed blinked, startled, as Margaret rose, clutching the dog tag, and retreated to her chambers. The courtroom buzzed with confusion, whispers rippling through the sparse crowd, but no one approached Jim, no one offered a word. He sat back down, his heart pounding, a flicker of hope warring with years of disillusionment. He'd been invisible for so long, a shadow in a town that had forgotten its heroes, and now this, a pause, a moment of recognition he hadn't expected. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Riverton in a silence that mirrored the courtroom's tension. Margaret sat at her desk, the dog tag resting in her palm, its weight pulling her back to 2003. Her brother, Paul, a medic in Iraq, had spoken of a Sergeant Holloway, a man who'd risked his life to save wounded soldiers during an ambush near Fallujah. Paul had come home with stories of Holloway's courage, a name etched into family lore. Margaret had been a teenager then, but she remembered the pride in her brother's voice. Now, that same Holloway sat in her courtroom, reduced to stealing bread to survive. She opened his file, her hands trembling as she read Brown Star, 2003, Purple Heart, 2004, Honorable Discharge, 2005, VA benefits terminated, 2011 due to lost records. The injustice hit her like a punch. How had a hero been abandoned so completely? She thought of Paul, killed in a car accident 5 years ago, his stories now her only link to that war. Returning to the bench, Margaret's expression was resolute. Mr. Holloway, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. This court orders an immediate review of your military records and VA status. This case is stayed pending further investigation. Reed opened his mouth to protest, but Margaret's raised hand silenced him. I'm also requesting pro bono counsel from the Veterans Advocacy League. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in, and for the first time in years, Jim felt the stirrings of something he thought lost forever: hope. The news of Jim Holloway's case rippled through Riverton like a stone dropped in still water, spreading from the courthouse steps to the diner, the barbershop, and the church pews. By the next morning, the courtroom was transformed, no longer a place of indifference, but a gathering of veterans, local activists, and a few reporters, their cameras flashing like beacons in the dim light. At the back stood 2 army officers in dress blues, their medals glinting, their faces etched with solemn pride. Jim shuffled in, his tattered coat replaced with a borrowed jacket, his eyes wide at the unexpected crowd. Beside him stood Rachel Bennett, a sharp-eyed lawyer from the Veterans Advocacy League, her briefcase brimming with documents. "Sergeant Holloway," she said, her voice firm. "We're here to set this right." Judge Margaret Ellis called the session to order, her gaze sweeping the room with a newfound intensity. Rachel stepped forward, her presentation meticulous as she laid out Jim's military record, the Bronze Star for valor under fire, the Purple Heart for wounds sustained saving a civilian convoy, commendations for leadership that saved countless lives. She then turned to the VA's failures, benefits lost due to clerical errors, medical care denied for lack of an address, a system that had spat him out after his service. "This man is a hero, Your Honor," Rachel concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. "And we've failed him at every turn." The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence eroded by the weight of evidence. He glanced at Margaret, who nodded for him to speak. "The state moves to dismiss all charges, with prejudice," he said quietly, his eyes avoiding Jim's. The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed through the room, sealing Jim's freedom. The crowd rose, not with applause, but with a quiet, reverent salute, the officers at the back snapping to attention, their hands raised in a salute to a brother in arms. Jim stood, tears welling in his eyes, the recognition overwhelming after years of invisibility. Margaret leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "This court recognizes Staff Sergeant James Holloway as a decorated veteran, not a criminal. His service will not be forgotten." The room hummed with emotion, a collective breath held and released, as Jim felt the weight of his past lift, if only slightly. Outside, the snow had stopped, and a weak sun broke through, casting a golden hue over Riverton's rooftops. Taryn Gwyn approached him, her smile warm. "I knew there was more to you," she said, handing him a coffee from Rosie's. The community began to stir. Veterans offered support, a local charity promised housing, and Rosie herself pledged free meals. Jim clutched Ellen's photo, whispering, "They see me now, Ellie." For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a future, fragile but real. As the courtroom emptied, a middle-aged woman with tear-streaked cheeks pushed through the crowd, her voice trembling. "Uncle Jim?" she called, her eyes searching. Jim turned, his breath catching as he recognized Sarah, Ellen's younger sister, whom he hadn't seen since the funeral 3 years ago. She'd been a college student then, her life ahead of her, but now she was a mother, her face a softer echo of Ellen's, same hazel eyes, same gentle curve of a smile. "I've been looking for you since Ellen passed," Sarah said, pulling him into a hug that felt like coming home. "We thought you were gone forever." Jim held her tightly, the warmth of her embrace breaking through the ice that had encased his heart. "I didn't want to be a burden," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "Your family," Sarah replied fiercely, stepping back to reveal a young boy, her son, Ethan, 8 years old, with Ellen's dimpled cheeks. "This is your nephew." Jim knelt, tears streaming as Ethan hugged him, the boy's innocence a balm to his wounds. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the snow into glistening puddles, a symbol of renewal. Judge Margaret approached on the courthouse steps, her robe billowing in the breeze. "My brother spoke of you often," she said, her voice thick. "You saved his life in Fallujah. I owe you mine." Jim shook her hand, the gesture a bridge between past and present. The Veterans Advocacy League moved quickly, securing Jim's back pay, $260,000, and enrolling him in a veterans housing program in Riverton. A local doctor offered free checkups, diagnosing malnutrition and PTSD, while a service dog, Max, a black Labrador, was donated by a veterans group, his presence a steady comfort. The town rallied. Rosie's Cafe hosted a fundraiser, raising funds for Jim's new start, and Taryn Gwyn organized a veterans support group. Sarah insisted he move in with her family, a small house on Oak Street, where Ellen's old rocking chair waited. That night, Jim sat by the fire, Max at his feet, Sarah and Ethan beside him, and pulled out Ellen's photo. "I'm home, Ellie," he whispered, tracing her face. The warmth of family, the promise of care, and the town's newfound respect wrapped around him like a shield, a redemption he'd never dared to dream of. 3 months later, Riverton transformed for a ceremony dubbed Day of Valor, held in the town square under a crisp March sky. Banners fluttered in the breeze, children waved small flags, and local businesses lined the streets with tables of food, hot pies, roasted potatoes, and steaming cider. A high school band played patriotic tunes, their notes carrying over the crowd of veterans, families, and curious onlookers. Jim stood on the stage, his new coat pressed over his dress uniform, the bronze star and purple heart gleaming on his chest, a stark contrast to the tattered figure he'd once been. The crowd erupted in a standing ovation, the sound rolling like thunder through the square, a recognition he'd thought impossible. Judge Margaret presented him with a plaque. "For unseen valor, Riverton honors James Holloway." Jim gripped the podium, his hands steady for the first time in years, the weight of eyes upon him both daunting and uplifting. "I didn't fight for medals," he began, his voice rough but clear, "or for thanks. I fought because you don't leave your brothers behind. But coming home, you hope someone remembers you, and you did." The crowd fell silent, 1,000 hearts beating as one, the air thick with emotion. He paused, his gaze drifting to Sarah and Ethan in the front row, then to Tara and Rosie, their smiles a testament to his rebirth. "This town gave me back my life," he said softly, "and I'll never forget it." The applause resumed, a wave of gratitude that washed away the years of neglect. Afterward, Jim sat on a bench in the square, Max dozing beside him, Sarah and Ethan chatting nearby. Children played, their laughter a melody of hope, while the flag above City Hall waved gently, casting shifting shadows. He pulled out Ellen's photo, her smile as vivid as ever. "We made it, Ellie," he whispered, tracing her face with a thumb. The first stars blinked above, and Jim felt the warmth of a community that had claimed him, a hero no longer invisible, his redemption complete under a sky that promised more tomorrows.